This is a Decentered podcast from Rob Watson. Conversations about community media. Look out for Decentered Media on Twitter and on iTunes, or go to decentered.co.uk. Hello, it's World Radio Day, and I'm Rob Watson, and I'm here at the Dr Media Centre with John Costa, and this is the Decentered Media podcast and vlog and live stream. This is in celebration of the 100th episode of the Decentered Media podcast, and we thought we'd do something a little different today in order to celebrate and really kind of have a set of really fantastic discussions about community radio and what community radio does and what it brings, which adds to our social experience as part of the UNESCO World Radio Day. With us for this final hour of our day is Dr Katie Moylan, who's based at the University of Leicester, although she's kind of been travelling around for a while doing some project work. And she's introducing to us a guest, Richard Davis from KUYI FM in Northern Arizona. How are you both?
Richard?
I'm well, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Great. So let's Katie, you prompted the discussion for this about your area of interest is Indigenous radio. Just kind of fill us in a bit in terms of what that is and paint us a picture of why it matters.
Okay, so we were discussing just before the 4 o'clock kind of kickoff time, Rob, that you'd sent out an email about today's series of events, and happy Radio Day to everybody, by the way. And I responded back saying, oh, this would be a nice opportunity to talk about Indigenous radio. And of course, the more I'm thinking about it, Indigenous radio covers so much. It's enormous. So when we say Indigenous radio, what I've been doing for the last year and a half is studying Indigenous radio or tribal radio or native radio, as it's variously referred to, depending who you speak to, mostly in U.S. contexts. But of course, Indigenous radio exists throughout the world. It's a global phenomenon where there are Indigenous communities who have access to radio and to a radio license and a station. There are so many stations around the world, and I hope is that we can all continue to connect up so we can kind of map them across the world. So when I think about Indigenous radio, I came to it because I was studying community radio anyway in U.S. contexts. And what I started looking at is community stations in places like New Orleans and Miami, because I saw these as places that kind of were very unique in the U.S. context as kind of having connections beyond the U.S.-ness culture, if you will. And I realized that I couldn't study community radio with any kind of depth in U.S. context unless I also started looking at Indigenous radio or tribal radio. And then as soon as I started looking, I saw that there's so much. And by that, I mean, there are estimated, depending who you speak to, between maybe 50 to 70 tribally managed, owned, run stations in the U.S. states. But keeping in mind, too, that when we talk about tribal radio and Indigenous radio, and this is true everywhere, outside of the U.S., of course, as well, when we say U.S., when we say Arizona, these are settler colonial terms. These are borders that were artificially drawn up. So when we think of these stations, they existed, the Hopi station, KUYI, has existed on lands of a community. It's one of the oldest in the land, in the actual lands. And I think it's so that's integral to how we understand this thing that we call Indigenous radio. And Richard can talk so much more about the specificities of what it's like to manage that and what it means to kind of produce collectively community radio that speaks to and of the tribe that it represents. So it's so enormous. I don't know where to start in a way or where to continue. I guess the value I see in it is that like the community stations I've studied previously, it's of and by and for the community it serves. Tribal radio stations tend to be under-resourced. The license type can vary. Many of them have community licenses or what we call low power LP licenses. So like other community stations, they struggle to kind of, keep studio space kind of, intact and keep resources coming in. It's also another category called tribal priority. Even looking at the license types, to zoom out a little bit, I know that today you guys have been talking about community radio in all forms. And sometimes talking about licenses can feel very dry and very formal. And I know we were catching the end of a conversation between the two of you guys about what it means to have regulation. But license types, they dictate what you can put on air and kind of your fidelity to your community, but also to the terms of your license. They do structure, I think, ways in which stations work. And that's, of course, true of tribal stations as well. I have a map that I've developed. Should I put that on screen?
Yeah.
I don't know if I can. Okay.
Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
Let me
make sure you can share the screen. So.
Okay.
Do you know when you need to do it and you can't remember how to?
I don't. I do.
Yeah. I should.
Good.
I thought I had this ready earlier. Security.
That's all right.
Share screen. There we go. You should be able to share the screen. I should have done that a while ago.
Okay, that's okay. And what do I?
So down by where it says there should be a button in the middle that says share screen. So when you scroll down, you get your underneath the bottom picture.
Okay. Record, invite. I might not have the permissions to this.
Yeah, you might need to post a link to it if you can in the chat, maybe.
Certainly, yeah. Let's do that. That's the best way. Okay, great. Okay, so here we go. In fact, that means that people can look at it as well, which I'd really appreciate. So this is it.
I can share it from this end.
Brilliant. So, great. Yeah. Okay. My technological limits are showing everybody.
Well, you've obviously been out of the corporate loop because everybody else is like drilled for using Microsoft Teams and Zoom and knows how to do it in their sleep now. Yeah. So you are one of the fortunate few. You've missed it. It's like missing the apocalypse.
Yeah, but it is the kind of thing that raises eyebrows. It's like, how come you're not Zoom savvy? In any case, I'll describe the reason I put together a map is because other organizations that serve Native American media have also put together maps of radio stations, but I wanted one that just kind of was focused on stations run by tribes, managed by tribes. I think it's coming up now. And just to kind of show where on the continent of North America these stations are and kind of to make us start thinking about reasons for that. I really like the idea of maps in terms of giving us an instant visual of how things are distributed. So I can describe what you might see in that a lot of stations you'll see are concentrated around what is known as Arizona, New Mexico, Southern California. There's a lot less out east towards the East Coast or even in the Midwest. But the thing is, this is not 50 to 70 tribal radio stations sound significant, and indeed it is. However, at last kind of official reckoning, there were 574 officially federally recognized tribes in the U.S., and that's not including unrecognized tribes that have been tribes for, of course, hundreds of years, which have just not been federally recognized as such. So actually, this amount of stations is an underrepresentation of these communities and groups. Okay, so what you can see here is you can zoom in on these if you guys want to do that in your own time, where if you zoom on one of the little red things, it gives you some station information, and in many cases, it gives you a link so you can listen directly. And of course, KUYI is on there as well. And also, if you zoom out a bit, you can see that there's several in Alaska. So again, this is just to kind of give a sense of how these are distributed, and just to see the thing about radio. I always think, especially community radio, is it's locally specific in all ways that we understand that to be. Okay, so it's based in its physical place. It's based in, and this is especially, I think, true of Indigenous radio, where the relationship to the land is central, is so integral to culture and to everyday life. So the physical placement of a station maybe resonates that much more. but it also means the everyday work of radio and of community radio in terms of reporting local news, talking about local, if there are traffic issues. In this country, in the UK, traffic is this huge thing, right? But also with tribal stations, weather is a huge thing. Depending on where you are, I've spoken to stations in Oklahoma. Oklahoma is not the only place in the US where there's extreme weather, as we're finding out, of course, but they get things like tornadoes. They get really rapid, sometimes crisis weather events. And the tribal stations are mandated to report on that. And they're often the first point of call for that really essential information. So when we say local, we mean that in these material ways, in these ways that point really to survival and to safety, but also the smaller things, the kind of feeling part of a community, the birthday shout outs, the community calendar, talking about community events. And that's even before, COVID-19 took hold and programming changed, which is a whole other conversation. But I know much earlier when you guys were talking to community radio practitioners, and they were talking about the fact that here in the UK, there's less and less top-down, say, BBC-run or public service local radio. And so community radio there and here is filling that gap of that local reporting. As I say, it's huge in my head. So if there's anything you want clarification on, that might help us zoom in.
Well, it's very succinct, and to have that overview is very helpful. And what we can do, if Richard doesn't mind this, is kind of fill in some of the gaps. And what does that feel like from the station operations end? You sit in front of the microphone and you help and support other people get in front of the microphone. What you just talk us through your approach? What do you do? Is it what you train and approach when new volunteers come in, or you've recruited a few people to do a particular kind of program? What's your style of engagement with people in terms of what they've got to relearn about doing community radio as opposed to imitating what they might get on mainstream corporate media?
Well, thanks for having me, Rob. And it's an honor to be with Dr. Moylan and the others on this show. Let me properly introduce myself first. Nahapi Richard Davis, Bahanyan Matsua, Nikyang Ne Rajit Hoya, Yan Hopi Matsua, Na Germany, Nikyang England, Wongwa Epkita, Nikyang Ne Flagstaff, Bunu KUYI Tamamongwi, Eptamaltaita. My name's Richard Allen Davis. I've been a guest on the Hopi Nation for going on 12 years now, and everything I say is spoken as a guest. And I'm very fortunate to be trusted as an Anglo within this community. And there's far more knowledgeable people on tribal radio than I. So there's the large asterisks. And I'll flip it around. As a guest in the community, it was me first that needed the proper training for how to operate culturally. Within the 55 to 70 broadcasters that Katie mentioned, they're all operating within their own cultural framework, their own land-based framework and historical background. So when it comes to how we identify as non-monster commercial stations like clear channel-based operations, each tribal station will speak from their own heart and their own community, as Dr. Moylan alluded to, that if there's any training whatsoever, it's to speak directly from personal experience. So in that way, there's a beautiful shared platform across community radio, because that probably could be copy and pasted for every small radio station. Speak from your experience. And as Katie mentioned, being a guest on one of the oldest continuously inhabited places in the continent, let alone in North America, rather, let alone broadcasting from that place, there's a lot of responsibility to hold true to the ethical and cultural values of this community and broadcast things that we're permitted to. And what our main focus on is highlighting the vibrancy and strength of the culture and the amazing intellect and thousands of years of everything from arts to music to research to science that exists within this community, and then project it back within the community itself through the community's own voice. So there's an internal dialogue within the community. And if that's of benefit to external listeners, as far as educating about who the community in which I'm a guest of is, so be it. And we carry on a beautiful legacy. KUYI went live in Bethel, Alaska, the same year I was born. Basically one of the first tribal stations. But we can go back a little further to 1969, the fall and winter of the occupation of Alcatraz, which was a federal prison offshore of San Francisco that the beautiful soul John Trudell broadcast. People call it pirate, but that's a demeaning term. Broadcast probably one of the first Indigenous live radio shows from Alcatraz. So we try and see ourselves as part of a community. And so if there's a second aspect to training, or how do we operate as non-commercial stations, it's realizing that we're part of a family, and that, as Katie rightfully spoke about, we need about 500 more tribal stations to get on air so there can be full representation. So we don't operate as the sole source. We operate knowing that there's sister and brother tribal stations out there as well, and to try to do that in unity. And it's KUYI. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, Richard, it's absolutely delightful to talk to you. And having met Katie before, obviously knowing how knowledgeable she is and passionate about this subject, it's actually great to reach out and meet you. I think what's interesting, I've been to America a couple of times, but I think what a lot of people don't realize is that, having been to Florida or somewhere like that, or somewhere like New York, is not America. It's such an amazing eclectic mix of people that all kind of come together. And, at the moment, you guys seem to be more divided than ever before. And maybe that's where the opportunities come, as opposed to your dalliance with democracy is over. But I think, when I look at what I do here at the Doc Media Centre in partnership with Rob, and we look at radio stations and community radio stations, how they operate around the world, particularly a colleague of ours in Baslu in Bangladesh, for example, that their radio stations, heavily represented by women and also people of the lower class, the caste system. That it's a real way of being able to communicate amongst themselves, about themselves, things that are important to themselves, as well as keeping things like, culture and music and stuff like that alive. I mean, there's a real, it's not just practical, is it? As Katie mentioned there, the weather and, sharing what's going on and stuff, but there's that real that, we exist, and it's a way of demonstrating to the outside world that you exist. I think, probably the pipeline has done more to raise awareness of some of the challenges that the communities that you're talking about there have when it comes to money and, people using tribal lands and things like that. So it's really important to keep these radio stations going, because there's so much more than just radio stations for entertainment, aren't there?
I'm just going to jump in and feel free to kind of either address this or ignore it and deflect it. I think the phrase that you used was, what is it? It was, it kind of in terms of operating culturally and embedding the radio experience in that, the roots of that culture. But here in the UK, and Katie might attest with this, which is what's interesting in terms of the contrast, we have a media system which only seems to put things out to the marketplace, that you can buy and sell radio stations. It's a transaction. And very few people are thinking about the cultural roots and the fact that you can't move So we're going through a process of consolidation at the moment with radio in the UK, where a lot of stations are being rebadged. They're losing their local identity. The commercial sector losing its local identity. And that's leaving a huge sense of social anxiety where people's local cultural expression and sense of identity. Now, I come from Liverpool originally, and there's a strong sense of identity based around being from Liverpool, both good and bad. There's the same Irish community radio has these really strong roots about social identity. And so it's, what are the lessons? What do we need to start to do to convince people that the model of what can we learn from Indigenous radio that we can apply here in the UK? Yeah, I knew it'd be one of those questions. Jump in.
Well, there's a lot there, going back a little bit, rewinding the tape, speaking about the so-called divide in our country. We're, as tribal stations, broadcasting from communities which experienced that first split historically. So there's been no surprise that 500 years of non-properly attended to white supremacy has resulted in our reality. So, the twice impeached citizen of Florida, there's nothing new there. There's nothing surprising about our current climate for those of us that have been exposed to the real history of this country. And mentioning the pipeline, I spent a very brief time, only a week or a little longer, at Standing Rock, and KLND, the tribal station there. Man, 24 hours a day during the Keystone XL water protector actions and rightful stance for sovereignty, brought to their community's ears every aspect of the oppression that was occurring there. And I put any equipment that I had in hands of fellow Indigenous or Indigenous travelers that I went with, and they did all the reporting and all the stories, and I was just doing medical work, first responder stuff. But when it comes to how stations over in the UK can grasp their own sovereignty, first off, Yaki Da to the Welsh folks tuning in, and the Gaelic communities, and it's the shared model, right? That if, and this is a cool thing that the National Federation of Community Broadcasters in the States is helping out with right now, if the airwaves through podcasts and other forms of digital media, then the community will contribute in order to keep hearing itself. And I think that model, a circular model of deriving content from your own community so you can increase support from your own community, it's not rocket surgery, right? It's pretty blatantly obvious, but it is a model that I think will take us forward into the future as how we can stay financially above water. And here, regulatory-wise, as a guest in a community that has done trade and in-kind and bartering since time immemorial, there's organizations like Native Public Media and NFCB that are pushing for federal recognition of this as the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, our largest funder in the States, calls non-federal financial support. So, we're demanding that the power structures that be recognize that we're broadcasting from communities that have been historically oppressed financially and purposefully had a lot of the ability to operate financially independently, removed from them policy-wise and through actual, wars. So one of the strongest ways that our own community retains its vitality is through working together, Natyas, working parties where everyone contributes. And so we're fighting for federal recognition of the oldest ways of community support, which is someone coming on and speaking in their native language. Even if that person doesn't have a doctorate in linguistics, they're not papered, their status, their dedication of time, their volunteering time should be elevated and recognized as an equal contribution than a monetary one. Right now, we have to raise $100,000 each year in order to receive our Corporation for Public Broadcasting grant. That threshold is the same for many communities like where I currently reside in Flagstaff, which has 75,000 people. If tribal enrollment on Hopi is around 15,000, and we're expected to raise $100,000 from that population, there's some great disparities that we're still fighting against. And there's beautiful souls at the Corporation for Public Broadcasting that hear this and recognize it and are helping us navigate how we get to parity. And it's not just tribal stations that face this. Historically Black colleges and universities, Latinx stations, we're all dealing with that same problem of how are we held to a high financial standard.
It's sorry to interrupt. It's something that we've just, it's been a theme through the day actually, which is really important, which is it's not just about equality of access, it's parity of access. Katie, what kind of, how do we convince our policy development frameworks and institutions to not just look at things? We have the same the argument is we have equal access regulations and anybody can apply, but not everybody can meet the requirements, the technical platform access requirements, the training requirements in order to be able to have their voice heard. It's about equity and parity, not just about equal access. What are the lessons from the struggle for Indigenous radio, Katie, in terms of achieving that parity?
Well, again, I feel like Richard has so much more nuanced, experiential kind of, he could contribute to this. But I'm struck so much about what you guys are all talking about in terms of the value of this work. So I guess the first thing I would say in terms of making a case for getting those greater resources is to listen to community members about the value that any station does give them in terms of, it's what Richard was saying and something I've argued myself, hearing oneself on air when one is, if you're a member of an otherwise marginalized community and you hear yourself on air, you hear your language, your dialect on air, that itself is, it's a complicated word, empowering, but we'll use it for now. It's empowering to hear yourself on this medium that broadcasts and now can be heard online. So arguing for that value alone. But I'm also struck by Richard's examples and reminded about how valuable this work of community broadcasting, of Indigenous broadcasting is with the Alcatraz example. And I agree, we call it pirate. I love pirate radio, and I know that's what I mean by that is, say, non-licensed radio, because that too is a community product. But I also agree that it's a problematic term saying pirate radio when it's so much more valuable. But I mean, especially in the US, then zooming back out to John's query a minute ago, or his raising of this, these things are not new. None of these currents happening, as Richard says, they're not new. They're just a little more visible and a bit more audible. So we need this community building and these opportunities and platforms for solidarity even more than we did. And what happened during, say, Black Lives Matter and the protests last summer is you had a lot of Indigenous support, which was of solidarity. And in turn, we have solidarity with pipeline activities and with activism there. And these connections are so valuable. So what I always say about community radio is true of Indigenous radio, which itself is a kind of community radio, and vice versa. There are commonalities and there are particularities. So the commonalities tend to be a general operating sometimes at material precarity, kind of struggling to keep oneself afloat. But those are commonalities, those are material commonalities. Other things are community building actions like shout outs, like playing different kinds of tribal musics, which people want to hear, but also a whole bunch of genres that are not necessarily tribal, like reggae gets a lot of love. Country res, which somebody at KWLP put me onto. Regular country radio. I mean, music too is community building. So I guess what I'm trying to suggest is that a community station like KUYI, but all the other stations that I've been able to tune into on a regular basis, they do this community building work in all these different ways, in overtly political ways, but also in just bringing people in and making them feel like they're part of something. So that's so valuable. And an ongoing concern of mine, I won't call it concern, an ongoing injustice is that people working in community radio are so often volunteers. They do it out of the love of what they do. They do it out of a felt responsibility for giving back. But that's unpaid work, and that shouldn't be unpaid work. So really, hopefully building on what Richard was saying. How you get those licenses, that's another point. And Richard can speak much more to this. You need resources to be able to apply. You need to know how to deal with the paperwork. You need to have that sense of confidence in expressing yourself. You need, to be familiar with that. And that itself takes time and energy and learning. Did I answer your question, my usual 7-sentence answer?
Absolutely perfectly. And you kind of prompted a thought in my head, which is about the idea of maybe rephrasing the language sometimes helps. Is that rather than thinking of us as community broadcasters or community reporters, we have to think of ourselves as community builders first and foremost. We're part of the team that goes in and digs the trenches and lays the bricks and erects the scaffold and on which the community can then function. We are part of that level of social integration. What's the process like for community building then, Richard? With KUYI, how do you know when it works and when it's working well?
That's a very hard question. I don't think, and again, it's a universal feeling. I don't think any community radio station can say they're fully living up to their potential, because we always want to do better. We always want to have more voices on. We always want to have a higher increase of Hopi Levi, the Hopi language, on air. And so we're always reaching for something higher, which is that cultural touchstone, which is the sharp contrast to commercial radio, right? Because they're always reaching for ratings and SIVA, money. So we know that we're attempting to do well when we do have people asking to come on air. And we know that we're doing okay when we have people contributing material for air. There's a huge hurdle of comfort, as we all know, to get into broadcasting. The majority of folks are not born to be so gregarious in the stereotypical broadcaster way. So we know we're successful when we're also reflecting all aspects of our community and their level of comfort. So if someone's not able to go on air, there's a lot of behind the scenes work that they can do. And that we try and have everyone have a finger in the operating of the station. And we're not there yet, admittedly, as a station. But when I look around and pre-pandemic, we had a gentleman that has a developmental disability. He was regularly hosting a Friday show for 2 hours. And if we have a visually impaired gentleman, elders, youth broadcasters, a children's show, if we can not tick boxes off, because we're not out here to compartmentalize, but if we can look around our station and see, yeah, this feels like the community we know, then I think we're doing good. And when it comes to advocacy at the federal level, I believe it was Obama that created the Office of Native Affairs and Priority at the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC. There was a phenomenal gentleman named Jeffrey Blackwell who fought for licensing parity. And we were able to get a low power FM license to reach our furthest Hopi villages that are about 60 miles outside of the main contiguous landform that our station couldn't reach because of terrain shielding. There's, land and then a dip, and then the community lived a little bit further down there. And so our signal, would not always reach them. So we were historically granted a low power FM signal, which generally is prohibited for rebroadcasting, to reach that community. And now we're trying to elevate content from that community, which we really haven't been able to do in the pandemic, except for one storytelling broadcast from that local school community. That's a short rambling answer to that one.
Well, you've got some fans now in the UK, because Vanessa at Derby Sound Radio has just sent a message through onto YouTube, and she said, inspiring stuff, Richard. The role of community radio always as a nurturing and striving to do more. And that kind of ethos, I think, is something we certainly has come through today in the earlier discussions as well. So it's a really good top and tail to our day, I think. Katie, that sense of nurturing. I'm just wondering if I've realised I've hogged this conversation. That sense of nurturing, and one thing we've talked about, and we've kind of touched on a little bit here, but we've talked about through the day as well, is the role of women within community radio. Because Richard, you're right. That kind of deprofessionalisation, the focus on care, the focus on, if you like, domestic work and domestic labour, and the role of women has perhaps been shifted more centrally into this. How does that play out have you got any, is there a gender balance in the Indigenous stations that you've been working with? What's that played out like?
Well, in every radio station physically, there's a brain room, and our brain room is named after Susan Brain with an E, one of the mothers of tribal radio who helped get stations on air in Montana. Peggy Berryhill. There's a long list of Native female advocates that we wouldn't exist without. Loris Taylor, the woman who founded KUYI. Every day we operate upon their labor, historic. It's essential that we have representation of everyone, and that we don't forget that we stand on the shoulders of tribal radio pioneers who are predominantly female. Folks that were fighting to have Montana mine environmental destruction highlighted, facilitated some of the first tribal radio stations in Montana. And that was a woman-led effort. It's crucial.
What's your experience, Katie? Because you've got this, you underestimate the importance of your wider picture view. You're very good at encapsulating that view. I don't think, you apologize. Forgive me for saying it like this. You apologize for it, and you really shouldn't, because it's very powerful, because it stitches it together. And we need both the specific and the general.
It's always, you never know what you sound like from the outside. Do you know what I mean? Especially perhaps in these times where I'm bumping shoulders less with people. But I guess for me, I'm just the more I look into just the Indigenous stations in the US, in North America, there's just so much more that I could be finding out, right? But yeah, the map helped me do that in a way that was me just kind of saying, what does this look like? But then go back to specifics. So there's a program broadcast in Dallas, Fort Worth, called Beyond Bows and Arrows, a name they chose for themselves, and you can find them on Facebook too. They broadcast from a community station in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. So it's not a tribal station, but it's a tribal program serving the different Indigenous communities of the Dallas-Fort Worth area. So they have a host, Albert Oldcrow, but really when you're in studio and when you're listening, a lot of kind of the community kind of facing work is also done by Jessica, who's in studio and taking the calls. And I mean, it always has to go back to specifics. I'm thinking too of KWLP, which Richard knows well, and their manager is Terry Hutchins, and she was instrumental in getting a tribal priority license. Also, actually, most of their broadcasters, now I think of it, they're almost all women at KWLP, yes. So I think Wanda did a lunchtime show, and DJ Getta does a morning show. And they're young women too. When I went to visit them in 2017, and from what I can see of their schedule still, yeah, most of the broadcasters there are women. And that too, going back to our point about what do you hear on air? You know, do you, as a young woman, say you're a Wallapai young woman, it's a Wallapai station, KWLP, and they're hearing young women on air. And that is great, because this is a contested point in radio anyway. Mainstream radio has been kind of dominated by white dudes. So anything that kind of counters that is always welcome.
More space for more people. And now we have, we've got a couple of minutes left. Now we have, we used to live in a world of scarcity. And it's not completely a world of digital plenty. Not everybody has equal access. Or parity of access, but we have more opportunities, podcasting, live streaming. We're not necessarily, as technology changes and as we look forward, do we think, Richard, that the individual examples and experiences will build into a broader pattern for social change?
They have to. And we have to operate out of the belief that we will reclaim the airwaves, and that we will have the voices that need to be heard amplified. And, to name drop just a couple other females, Antonia Gonzalez, a phenomenal tribal reporter, and Tara Gatewood, both operating out of Native Voice One. And they host Native America Calling and National Native News. If there's one recommendation for folks that want to hear what's going on in tribal America right now, in Indigenous country, Native Voice One gets my supreme shout out. Native America Calling and National Native News, great places to start. And they also answer that question by elevating the stories every day to the level that they deserve to be heard from the First Nations experience.
Well, that's suitably inspiring. I think it's a lesson that really dovetails, as I said earlier, it kind of tops and tails the discussions we've had all day. There is strong support on our YouTube feed for empowered women to be taking the reins of community radio here in the UK. And so, yeah, I think, Katie, we need that bridge. We need to learn from one another and to recognise that this is, this is the start. And you're right. Richard, we just need to take control of the airwaves for ourselves and do good stuff with it. So I'm going to say thank you at this point. It's been a fantastic opportunity to just touch the surface of a deeper pool that I'm sure that we can immerse ourselves in at some later period. We can always follow on. I'll put links. There are links on the blog posts and the website. I'm going to repurpose the video and the audio as podcasts, so hopefully more people can engage with them as well. But once again, thank you very much. Stay safe, stay warm. Enjoy the gap between the snow that you have over there in northern Arizona, and we're due now. The weather front is milder So it's going to shoot up from -1 to about 11 degrees in about 2 days. So we've got Atlantic weather coming in rather than Eastern weather now. So we're due a change. So we can relax a little bit more. But once again, thank you very much. It's been wonderful to chat with you both. Thank you for your time.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, John.
Thanks, Richard.
Thank you, Dr. Moylan.
Good to see you.
Be safe.
Take care. You too.
You've been listening to the Decentered podcast. I'm Rob Watson. If you want to find out more information, contact me on Decentered Media via Twitter or go to decentered.co.uk.